Robert Silvers is known as the father of photo mosaics. Behind me is one of his most famous ones. It's of Louis Armstrong. Standing from afar, you see the famous musician playing his trumpet. I'm pretty sure, his trumpet. But if you get a little closer, this is what you're going to see. A series of photos from Louis Armstrong's life, all compiled together to make that larger portrait of him. Every photo is a scene from his life, and they're all brought together to paint this portrait of this man. Now, at quick glance, it might seem like an ordinary photograph. If you were driving on the freeway, you would just think, there's a photo of Louis Armstrong. But if you were to stop and look and pay attention, you would see all of these intricate details strategically placed to paint this portrait. It is this idea of a photo mosaic that I want to anchor our time in together today. We've been in a series entitled The Story of God, where as a community, we've been looking at the story the Bible is telling. You see, it's our conviction here at Zion that the Bible is a story. Fundamentally, it's the story of God. And our working definition for the Bible is this: it is a library of ancient writings that are both divine and human, that together tell a unified story that leads us to Jesus. You see, we've broken this story out into 6 acts or movements: creation, fall, Israel, Jesus, the church, and new creation. And over the last few weeks, we've looked at the first 2 movements in creation and the fall. Now, we are coming to our 3rd installment, which is Israel today. And if you've been with us, you might be getting concerned because we're only on the 3rd page of this thing. And so how on earth are we going to make our way through the whole Bible? Well, today we are taking the largest section in the series thus far, and I'm going to be doing my best to break that down. Now, the best way for us to begin this endeavor is to talk a little bit about the Hebrew Bible, or as it's also known, the Old Testament, and go over some of its structure and movements. Now, many of us have a very complicated relationship with the Old Testament. We're not exactly sure with what to do with it. It's got children's stories that you've heard when you were younger, like David and Goliath and Noah's Ark and things of that nature, right? And the New Testament, we're mostly down with. It's like the New Testament's good. It's got all the stuff, stories about Jesus, Paul's teaching, which is confusing, but a little bit more clear than some of these really strange stories in the Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament is comprised of 39 different books and several authors spanning over a wide variety of time. And here's the important thing. It's the majority of the Bible you hold. A majority of the Bible you hold, 3/4 of the Bible you hold, is the Old Testament. And so you have to figure out what to do with it and what your relationship is to it in order to understand this story. Now, in the Bibles that many of you hold, they have broken the Old Testament out into 4 sections: the Pentateuch, the historical books, poetry, and prophetic literature. And this is totally a fine way to group them. However, there is a more ancient, and I think more interesting way to group them that is in line with the ancient Jewish tradition and how they grouped them. And this way of grouping the Old Testament was known as the Tanakh. Now, understand, it's the same books, it's just how we've organized them. And so the ancient way, the way that it's been for millennia up until the church and Christians and the Bible as we know it today, they were organized into 3 different movements. First is the Torah, next is the Nevi'im, and last is the Ketuvim. And these basically translate to the teaching or law, the prophets, and the writings is essentially how these break out. And this is how ancient Jewish people categorize the Old Testament. Now, the Old Testament is usually thought of as one collection. We think it's just one book. But in the ancient Jewish tradition, it was a 3-part collection of scrolls that were all unified in their message. And so again, containing the same exact books, just organized differently. So there in the Torah, we have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the Nevi'im, we have Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, as well as the prophets, the 3 major, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor. They're all listed there for you. I'm not going to read them all. If you want to, feel free. But for time today, we don't have time. And lastly is the writings, which is the Psalms and wisdom literature, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, Ruth, etc. And so this is the collection that Jesus grew up with and the way that he refers to the Old Testament himself. Notice this, Luke 24:44. And having a conversation with the religious leaders of his time, he says unto them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, in the prophets, and the Psalms." Jesus refers to the Old Testament in this same way, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim. The Psalms are just a shorthand way of saying writings. They're synonymous with one another. And so this is the way that Jesus grew up with the Old Testament being organized in this same manner. And so for our time today, we're going to move through these 3 movements the way that the ancient Jewish authors had them organized. First with the Torah, then with the Nevi'im, and last with the Ketuvim, or the teaching the prophets and so, one last feature I want to talk about before we jump into the narrative itself. And I want you to recall in your mind the image of Louis Armstrong, this photo mosaic. Everything in the Old Testament has significance. Eugene Peterson, in his breakdown of the Bible, says this: everything has significance. Since story implies author, nothing is in it by accident. Nothing is mere filler. Chekhov once said that if a writer puts a gun on the table in the first chapter, somebody has to pull the trigger by the last chapter. Every word connects with every other word in the author's mind, and so every detail, regardless of how it strikes us at first, belongs and can be seen to belong if only we look long enough at it. Every detail in the Old Testament narrative serves a purpose. Now, within the Old Testament, there are layers upon layers upon layers of Easter eggs and hyperlinks, all connecting to one another. And today, for me to summarize all 39 of these different acts telling this larger story would take forever. So I'm not going to be able to get into all of them. But remember that the Bible is ancient Jewish meditation literature, meaning the goal is for you to spend so much time in it, you begin to see the Easter eggs. It is like watching The Lord of the Rings with somebody who's a huge Tolkien fan. You know what I mean? It's like they catch every little thing. You see that here, you see that there, this means this there. Like they get to explain every little detail that is nuancing out bits and pieces of the story. And so in the same way, in the best film and media and music we love, there's all these little Easter eggs leading up to the meta-narrative. The biblical authors do the same thing. Now, as we've been doing in this entire series, my goal today is to move through these acts in movements to maintain the understanding of the Bible as one big story, one meta-narrative. Now, recall our definition about what the Bible is. It is a library of ancient writings, both divine and human, that together tell a unified story that leads us to who? Jesus. So, we're going to be looking at different acts and pieces, different individual photos in the mosaic today. But if we were to take a step back, there's one portrait we see, and it is Jesus. That is what the Old Testament is like. Jesus saw the Old Testament in the same way. Again, in one of his conversations, he says this: you study the scriptures diligently because you think that in them you have eternal life. But these are the very scriptures that testify about me. It is Jesus' understanding that the portrait of the New Testament, or the Old Testament is painting, is a portrait of himself. And so as we move through these moments, I'm going to be calling out moments and individual scenes that are teaching us to see the larger portrait, which is that of Christ. And I've split this into 4 large movements: East of Eden, Blessing the World, Kings and Kingdoms, Son of Man. These may mean nothing to you now, but by the end, I hope that they do. First, East of Eden. So last week, we concluded the message with humanity being removed from the Garden of Eden, and they are moved east of Eden. This phrase, moving east of Eden, or moving towards the east, will serve as a pattern through the rest of the Genesis narrative. And we stumble upon two brothers, Cain and Abel. This is probably a story that you're familiar with. Cain is jealous of his brother Abel and decides to murder him. And it is in this moment of angry decision that God comes to him to speak with him about what is taking place in his heart. Genesis 4. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right," notice this line, "sin is crouching at your door. It is desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Cain and Abel are the offspring of Adam and Eve, and there is tension, sibling rivalry taking place between Cain and Abel, and Cain's heart is being led towards murder. So God in mercy comes to him, letting him know what is taking place. That sin is like a beast crouching in the field. Think of a lion ready to pounce on a gazelle. And the door is symbolic of Cain's heart. And it says it's waiting for you to make that move so it may consume you. You see, Cain feels rejected because God has blessed Abel's offering and has not blessed his. And so this sibling rivalry will too be a design pattern throughout the book of Genesis. All the way through, we see tension between siblings. Now, I want you to recall in your mind last week when we talked about there's this hostility between the seed of the woman and the seed of the snake. There's this hostility between them, right? He will crush your head and you will strike his heel. Now, sin is personified as a beast ready to devour Cain, or ready to devour Cain here in this story. And what happens next is Cain succumbs to sin. He murders his brother Abel, and he fails to overcome the power of the snake, the serpent in the garden. What happens next is it tells us that Cain builds a city, guess in what direction? East of Eden. Now, this community of Cain grows, and they continue in the pattern of succumbing to the power of the snake. It becomes more contentious, more murderous, and then we get this guy named Lamech, whose name is a play on words. It basically alludes to the fact of corrupt king is essentially what his name means. And he is so bent on evil. He is so consumed by the power of the snake that he's collecting wives as property, and he's bragging about his murderous acts. And he brags that he will be far more murderous than Cain ever was. Evil has consumed his heart. And so Lamech is an archetype for the rest of what's happening to humanity, and all of them have succumbed to the power of the snake, and they continue to progress towards evil. And they have said to God, essentially, "We want nothing to do with you." And so God says, "Fine, have it your way." In the Genesis narrative, who is the one who brings order to chaos? Not a trick question. God, right? Don't worry, I'm not going to fail you if you say the wrong answer. It's God, right? God brings order to chaos. He separates the waters. He makes the earth inhabitable for people. And they say, "We want nothing to do with you," so God removes his hand. And the earth becomes, remember, tohu vavohu again, wild and waste, and the waters overcome the earth again, known as the story of the flood. But God, in his mercy, preserves a remnant, a man named Noah, whose name means rest, and his family. Now, we begin to see them as a sort of new creation, starting the story again, and they find themselves, as the waters recede, they find themselves positioned on a mountain, and it is there that Noah cultivates a new garden, and he begins to live there with his family. But one day, Noah gets drunk off the grapes. They makes wine from his garden, and something really sketchy happens with one of his sons, and they progress towards darkness again. You're hoping that Noah and his family will be this seed who will overcome the snake, but they fail. And this becomes an archetype too. We follow the line throughout the book of Genesis, and we see that continually, story after story, continually people fall to the power of the snake, and humanity grows more evil until they move east again and build a new city called Babel, otherwise known as Babylon. Genesis 11. Now the whole earth had one language and a common speech, and as people moved which direction? Eastward. They found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." And they used bricks instead of stone and tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens." Notice this line, "that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered over the face of the earth." There's way too much going on here to talk about everything happening in Genesis 11. But essentially, a new city is built by the power of the snake again, saying we will ascend to God. We will define good and evil on our own terms. We will make a name for ourselves. We will be like the gods. Now, they move eastward and build this city. Like, where have you seen this pattern before? You've seen it continue in the same direction. Now, God knows that if this happens, that more corruption and evil will take place. So God confuses their language and scatters them. But this city, Babel, otherwise known as Babylon, will become an archetype for the rest of the biblical narrative about a city that's bent against God. Now, this is where we find ourselves in our teaching text today. Everyone's moved east of Eden and continually falls to the power of the snake. Craig Bartholomew and Michael Goheen, in their book, The Drama of the Scriptures, says, "The effect of the fall on all of us is not that we stop being human. We remain the image of God." But notice this line, "but our rebellion has deeply affected how we are human." You see, the people in the story retain the image of God, but how they reflect that image is what's become corrupt. And so you finish chapter 11 in despair. Is there any hope for humanity? Then opens up chapter 12. We follow one of these family lines from Babel or Babylon, and we come to a man named Abram, who will later be known as Abraham. It is here that God chooses Abraham to work through to bring about his purposes. Here's what he tells him. Genesis 12, verse 1. "The Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all the people on earth will be blessed through you.'" What is the word you keep hearing over and over and over again in just these first 3 verses? Blessing, blessing, blessing. This is God's heart for humanity. He has not given up on them. Though they have rebelled against him, God chooses one family to be his vehicle through whom he works in to unleash blessing on his enemies, on those who've rebelled against him. It is his heart to still restore them. And so God here is wanting to save the world through one family. What God wants to do is redeem all of humanity, and he's going to choose a family to do that, to work through, right? Why? What's the purpose of him blessing Abraham? Is so that he will be a blessing to who? All of the nations. And so Abraham and his family become this channel of blessing to be unleashed on the world. Now, side note, I just find this so compelling. Okay, imagine if you were God and you created humanity and they've done what's happened through Genesis 1 through 11, what are you doing? Right? You have coworkers and children who are slightly disobedient to you, right? And not nearly this vile and awful. And how do you respond to them when they act in disobedience? Okay, how does God choose to respond here? Like if it were any of us, we would wipe the slate clean. Come on, right? But God chooses not to. Or at least, I don't know, show up and scare the heck out of them so they would trust you or follow you. But no, God chooses the avenue of invitation, not manipulation. He just chooses to do a family and say, I'm going to work through this family in such a way that it will be compelling to the rest of the world to know me. This shows the heart of the Father. It's just beautiful. Now, a few chapters from this moment, Abram begins to doubt that this is going to happen. Why? Well, he says that God's going to bless his family, but him and his wife haven't had any kids, and it's safe to say the clock has been ticking for a long time, right? They are up in their age, into their 80s, and still no kids. And so Abram's like, hey, dude, if there's any time you're going to do this, now would be super solid, right? It would be really good. And God reaffirms, he sets Abram's heart at ease and making a covenant with him. He formalizes this promise in the term of a covenant. Now, covenant's super religious language. I don't think any of you have made a covenant this last week, right? Unless you've gotten married or something. I don't think any of you have entered in any sort of covenants, right? You're not doing business dealings and referring to those as covenants. But essentially what a covenant is, it is a formal and relational partnership to accomplish a goal. This is not foreign for Abraham. Throughout the rest of the biblical narrative, you see different kings and leaders make covenants with one another, right? One is famously Solomon, and a nearby leader make a covenant to exchange goods with one another, right? This is a common thing that happens throughout the biblical narrative. Now, a covenant is not merely a contract. It's not merely a business dealing. There's a whole other side to it that's relational. You're not just binding yourself to a certain set of outcomes. You're binding yourself to that other person, right? It's not just as long as it comes to this sort of agreement, but it's actually me and you together in this and also these other agreements. Tim Keller on covenant says this: the covenant is a stunning blend of law and love. Stunning because it's a personal relationship made more loving and intimate because it is made legal. It is this way through voluntary, mutual, binding promises and vows to be loving and to be faithful no matter what the circumstances are. This is essentially the heart behind a covenant. Now, God chooses to make this covenant with Abram, but here's the crazy part. God goes in the covenant alone. This is a part of the story that I'm not going to lie is weird for modern ears, but it's not weird at all for ancient ears. One of the ways you'd make a covenant, prepare yourself for this, is you chop an animal in half. Hang on, we're getting there. And you would set either half of the animal on either side, and you would do this to a series of animals, essentially creating a pathway. Hang with me. And what you would do is the person you're making this covenant with, you would walk through this bloody pathway together. Again, I realize this is weird for you. Not weird at all for an ancient person. And this is the sign of the covenant. Now, essentially what you're saying in this act is what happened to these animals will happen to me if I break this covenant. So it is a deeply ritual, symbolic thing. I don't see us doing this anytime soon, but this was very much a part of their culture and life, right? It was very significant. Covenants were a really, really big deal to them. So God promises Abraham, I'm going to make this covenant with you. I'm going to bless you, people, all that stuff. And then Abraham's like, how can I know? God's like, go get a heifer. A what? A cow. Get some doves, get some other animals, bring this, and then now do what? Cut them in half, right? We're going to do this thing. So Abraham does it. Everything's laid out. And what's a really funny detail about this text is it tells us that he has to shoo away the crows from coming and picking at the animals he's laid out. And then Abraham takes a nap. The text tells us he falls into a deep sleep. God has done this before with another character whose name is Adam. When Eve is introduced, he falls into an ekataxis, a deep sleep, a trance, a vision, if you would. It's the same word that Peter has for his vision when he sees that the food is all clean, and it's his ministry of the Gentiles, etc. So he falls in this deep sleep, and guess who walks through the pathway? God, but he walks it alone. Abraham has still made this covenant with God, but here's what God has said: the consequences are on me. I will be faithful to uphold this covenant, even if you don't. Right? Beautiful. It makes the animal sacrifice thing a little bit more beautiful, right? And so no matter how much Abraham or his descendants fail to live up to their end of the covenant, God will be the one who bears the consequences of it. He will remain faithful to his promise. Now, we focus in the rest of the Genesis narrative on three individuals: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Isaac is Abraham's son, Jacob is Isaac's son. And you're hoping that one of these individuals will be the one who overcomes the snake, who will overcome evil. But story after story, all of them fail. Read the Genesis narrative. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are not model citizens, right? They're lying, they're scheming, and it seems that they get progressively worse. All of them are throwing their wives under the bus. It is a whole mess, okay? Just read the Genesis narrative. And so you go through each of their stories, and you're like, okay, it ain't none of them. And then Jacob has 12 sons. And you're like, okay, we got a larger population here. One of y'all has to do something good. And the first story opens up that Jacob has a favorite son, and his name is Joseph. And he gets them this super dope Technicolor robe to let all the other brothers know he's the favorite. How do you think that's going to turn out? We've seen sibling rivalry already, even in Jacob's story with his brother Esau. How do you think that's going to favor Joseph? They plan to kill him. But better heads prevail, and they make a lesser thing and say, nah, we'll just sell him into slavery instead. What good brothers do. And so they sell him into slavery, and Joseph, through all kinds of crazy twists and turns, call it providence, call it fate, call it the Lord, whatever you want, comes to power and is second in command over all of Egypt. When a famine strikes that brings his brothers to him in Egypt needing food. And there's this beautiful story that Joseph does there to get them to admit what they did. Don't believe me, read the story, Genesis 48 and on. And there's this moment at the end of Genesis where Joseph is talking with his brothers. And this is what he had to say. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done. Hear this, the saving of many lives. Now, you might think that's just like a gangster line to tell his brothers. But this happens right at the very end of Genesis to tell you, this is what this whole story's been about. Humanity has been heaping evil, corruption, destruction, all into God's good world to bring about harm. But God, in all of it, is still bringing about good. And that's how the Genesis narrative ends. And we open up to Exodus. Now, time passes, and a Pharaoh comes to power who has no agreement with the Israelites, and they have grown exponentially, and this causes fear in the heart of Pharaoh, and so he wants to do some population suppression by murdering kids. Pharaoh is not a good guy in this story. And so the people of Israel become enslaved by Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is murdering children. But one child gets saved in this. And they are put in a basket and sent down the water. Can you think of a story where the seed is kept from harm by going in a vessel in the water? Flood narrative, anyone? Moses, whose name means saved from the waters. Come on, right? Come on. Insane. And so this child is pulled from the waters, and God uses him to deliver the people from slavery. And you know the story, the 10 plagues, let my people go, right? The whole thing. You've seen the animated movie, all of it, which has an incredible soundtrack, if we could just be honest. The old animated one is so good. Now, in recalling this story, right, God brings them over to the other side. They cross the Red Sea. It's all this miraculous things, and you think, finally, the God and his people, they're going to be in the land. They're going to be with God. It's going great. And here, God renews his covenant with Israel again on a place called Mount Sinai. Exodus 19. He says, you yourselves saw what I did in Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations, you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Recall the blessing to Abraham. Why is Abraham being blessed? That he may be a blessing to who? All the nations. What are priests? Priests are people who represent the people to God and God to the people. He is calling Israel to be his representatives in the world to show what he is like. And he does this through covenant. First, the 10 Commandments, then the other 613 laws that are going to set this people apart to be a compelling witness to the world of what Yahweh is like, what it's like to be in relationship with him. Again, Craig Bartholomew and Michael Goheen. As the Israelites obey God, they will demonstrate that what life under God's reign will look like. The nations will be able to catch a glimpse of God's plan for all peoples. The whole of Israel's experience will reflect God's character and God's original creation intention for human life. Israel's life under God is to testify to the living presence of God within God's people, and is to be such a full and rich human life that the nations of the earth will be drawn to it. This is what is meant to happen. And this is the first movement of the Old Testament. However, what happens next? Well, the Israelites get tired of waiting on God. And they're in the wilderness and like, Egypt had such better food than this manna you provided miraculously from the heavens, right? And they begin to complain. Moses loses his anger and is unable to bring them into the promised land. And so Moses dies in the wilderness, as does the whole other generation. And they're longing to enter into the land God has for them. Which brings us to our next movement, that of kings and kingdoms. So as we arrive in the story, Joshua brings the people into the promised land. And you think things are finally getting on their foot, and you think that Joshua will be the one who will overcome the snake. But assuredly, Joshua fails as well. The power of the snake still has a stronghold on him, and throughout the story you see leader after leader become more and more corrupt, following suit and serving other gods, seeing and taking for themselves. And so they end up in the promised land ultimately, but because of the rebellion and wickedness, God is not there with them. Now throughout the story, there are 3 prominent roles, that of priests, prophets, and kings. These are all people who are meant to represent God to the people and be leaders and influencers. And all of these characters who fill these roles ultimately fail. Some of these we'll talk about a little bit later in the story. But God is inviting these people to partner with him in bringing about his purposes in the world, but they continually choose evil, choose to define good and evil on their own terms, and not trust God. Now, there's a line of wreckage in the King's story. Just read 1st and 2nd Kings, and you can see there's a progression where it gets worse and worse. And now there's highlights, people like David and Solomon, who you think, the snake crusher has come, the one who, and they will fall to the snake as well. Now, this whole narrative about priests, prophets, and kings all failing is running in one way, and then there's a whole other set of literature that's running alongside of it. In the next section that we're in right now, the prophetic literature, there's the narrative, the story of all of these people falling and succumbing to the snake. And then there's this whole other pattern of what's called prophetic literature, where there's three major ones, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, and 12 minor prophets. Can you think of a story where we focused on 3 individuals and then 12 other individuals? Right? This was Abraham's line. Dude, Easter eggs are everywhere. Are you kidding me? Anyways, so 3 major prophets, 12 minor prophets. And the whole time, all of these prophets are saying, please stop doing what you're doing. Please stop. If you don't stop, bad things are going to happen. And they compile this to a phrase known as the day of the Lord. It is this idea that if you continue to rebel against God's covenant, judgment is coming. You will no longer be able to partake of God's blessing if you continue to rebel against him. Now, God is so patient. This is not just like one set of people. It is generation after generation. Just read the story. Read the narrative. It is over and over and over again. And God is raising up all these prophets saying, please turn, please stop, please obey, return to Yahweh, please, 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 please. And they refuse. And so ultimately, the day of the Lord comes. And the people of Israel are pushed out of the land, and they are returned into exile. Now, Michael Goheen and Craig Bartholomew, in recalling the story, said this too. God is portrayed throughout the Old Testament as moving slowly and regretfully towards his judgment. I mean, just read the prophetic literature. It's over and over again. It almost gets like, okay, dude, enough. They're not listening. But they're begging and pleading. And guess where they end up exiled? Babylon. We return to the place from the very beginning where they were exiled outside of the east of Eden. They end up back in Babylon under the rule of oppressive rulers. Exiled again. Now, they end up underneath the rule of this empire of Babylon. But in all of this, the prophets' messages weren't just about the day of the Lord. And all of the prophets, there's also this symbols and signs of hope that one day the snake crusher is going to come. And he's going to restore blessing to all of humanity. He's going to redeem Israel. And he's going to make things right again. All throughout the story, they're being reminded of this. And they're looking forward to it. He has so many names. The servant. Isaiah uses all kinds of that imagery in his prophetic literature. But you're looking for this one who they call the Messiah, the anointed one, to come and to set them free. Which brings us to our last section, which is the Ketuvim. The Ketuvim opens up with the book of Psalms, which is like everyone's favorite book in the Bible. Let's really be honest, right? It's like, it's the one through and through. You go to it, it blesses you. You know what I mean? But the Psalms open up kind of strange. The first 2 Psalms. The first Psalm is all about an individual who heeds the word of God, and as they heed the word of God, they become like a tree of life, full of blessing, plugged in to God's blessing and flourishing. And there's another type of person who doesn't heed the story, who withers away and dies. The Psalms are setting up the whole narrative all over again. And they're saying, find yourself in this story. Heed this story. And if you do, there will be blessing. And if you don't, there will be wasting away. Is this a theme that we've seen throughout the Old Testament where God is putting before individuals a choice to choose between trees, to become a people of blessing or of cursing, of life and of death, to choose the tree of life or to choose the tree of the knowledge of good? And it's, guys, the Easter eggs are everywhere. Then there's Psalm 2, which is all about this promised one, this Messiah who will come from God, who will overcome the evil empires and the seeds of the snake, and will establish his rule and reign on the earth. And then the rest of the Psalms are all about how we live in the tension between those two realities. how we live as a people who glean wisdom from God and live in the tension of empires and evil rulers, etc., etc. Now that's the beginning of the Ketuvim. The end of the Ketuvim is that of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which if you've done a read-through the Bible ever in your life, it feels super familiar reading 1st and 2nd Chronicles because it's the whole story all over again. It is like the authors are trying to get you to see that as you've made your whole way through the Old Testament and you're finishing up, they tell you the story one more time just to make sure that you see it, the story as a whole. Now, throughout the story of the Chronicles, you see humans choose not to trust God and bring about brokenness and oppression. Then they call out to God. God delivers them. And then they revert right back to defining good and evil on their own terms over and over and over and over and over again. And this section, the Ketuvim, also contains books like Ezra and Nehemiah about how Israel ultimately makes its way back to the land promised by Abraham, but a majority of the Israelites are living in something called the diaspora. They're scattered all throughout the world. Now, in the middle of these books is the wisdom literature. Now, we do not have time to go through all the wisdom literature and talk about what those mean. But essentially, the books of wisdom are all about wrestling through the questions that the story brings up about the journey that you've been on with these authors and to ask difficult questions about how to live in this world. Right? Proverbs is all about eating from the tree of life and living in wisdom. Ecclesiastes is like if you're super moody and like everything's broken, and even when I do it right, it doesn't work, right? It's like and then Job is asking the deep existential question of the world: why is there evil in the world? To which there is no answer, just more questions, and just a response from God that says, "Were you there when I made the world? Deal with that," right? All of these wisdom literatures are inviting us into the tension to wrestle with the story. And then there's one book that I want to talk about. It's the book of Daniel. Now, Daniel starts out as these young Jewish men living underneath the rule of Babylon, trying to be faithful to Yahweh, trying to maintain faithfulness to Yahweh. And that's the first half of the book. And that's the ones that we tell in the kids' class. You know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There's even songs about it and all this other stuff, right? But the last half of the book is weird. There's all these visions and dreams and statues and rocks hitting these statues and beasts. You know, what is going on? The first half of the book is all about remaining faithful in exile. And the last half of the book is how there will be a kingdom that will come that will wipe out these other evil kingdoms, and that will never end. There's one vision in particular where it shows all the kingdoms of the world being fallen down and one kingdom rising up, and that kingdom never falls. And so we're meant to see in this story that God is continually working with humans to bring about his purposes of the kingdom through and through, even though evil continues to press against it. T. Desmond Alexander, in this beautiful book, a biblical introduction into, I forget, we're reading it for the 5. Anyways, it's a whole thing about the biblical theology, an introduction to biblical theology. He says this: a significant and reoccurring theme in the Old Testament is the establishment of God's kingdom here on earth in the face of sustained and violent opposition. You read the whole Old Testament, and here's what you see. The whole story is about God has been faithful to keep his promise even when humanity hasn't. Remember the covenant God made with Abraham. He walked through alone and kept his side of the bargain. Now, in Daniel, there's one more figure I want to mention. He's called the Son of Man, which literally means the human one. This whole time, we've been looking for a seed of the woman who would be the human one. The whole story, you are looking for one who will be human, but a different kind of human, the kind of human that can overcome the snake. And we see in this vision of Daniel that this Son of Man is lifted up, and he's able to overcome the powers of the empires and the power of the snake. All of the Old Testament is building towards this Son of Man. And so throughout the story, you come to Abraham and you think, is he the human one? Is he the Son of Man? No. his story starts out promising, but Abraham takes matters into his own hands, sleeps with his wife's servant, throws his wife under the bus a couple of times. He's not the one. Is it Moses? It starts out super promising for him too, but Moses succumbs to the power of the snake, takes situations in his own hands, kills an Egyptian, the whole story in Exodus there. It's not him. Is it David? Oh, he starts off so promising, slaying giants and leading the people of Israel and being faithful. But one day, he stays back from war, and he sees a woman bathing on a rooftop, and he decides to take her. He sees, and he takes, and succumbs to the power of this. Guys, Easter eggs are everywhere. And he falls. And so story after story, leader after leader, you're looking for the one who will crush the snake. But remember what I told you in the beginning. Everything has significance. As you close the Old Testament, you're looking for the one who will be the Son of Man, who will come from the line of David to restore God's blessing. And not to get ahead of myself, but do you have any idea how the New Testament opens? It starts off with the genealogy. If you read Matthew, that first chapter is so-and-so begot, so-and-so who begot, so-and-so begot, so-and-so. Yeah, you stop pronouncing the names, you just kind of peruse on, let's get to chapter 2 where the good stuff happens. Why is it doing that? You're looking for one from the line of David, and you're following the genealogy of the line of David, and you find a poor Jewish carpenter named Jesus. Do you know what the way that Jesus referred to himself more than anything else? He didn't call himself Messiah. He called himself the human one, the Son of Man from Daniel. He called himself the fulfillment of the whole story. It is Jesus. Jesus is the Son of Man. And so, as you step back from the Old Testament, you see just one portrait. It's the portrait of Jesus, all the way through. He's the one who our hearts long for. That's the Old Testament. Come on. This thing is so cool, dude. Am I right? And we just talked about it for like 40 minutes. There's a world in here, brothers and sisters. There's a world in here. And don't get caught up looking at the singular frame, but always step back and see the whole portrait. It's Jesus. It's Jesus. We're going to enter into a time of worship and response now, where we just sit with the story as a whole. The story, this unified story that leads us to Jesus. The one who is the snake crusher. And we're just going to worship him. Because it's him who our hearts have been looking for this entire time. Would you join me in singing?